Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining me for this exploration of how neotropical habitats sustain migratory land birds in the Americas flyway. So during the course of this presentation, I'm very much going to be focusing on the role of neotropical habitats as stopover sites in particular, although I will be delving briefly into how they're used as stationary non-breeding areas. And before we really get started, I just want to explain a little bit of the background and history of this body of work I'm going to be showing you. So this work has been led by SELVA and primarily has been undertaken in Colombia, but also through Central America. And in this map you're seeing here, each of those black symbols represents a study site where at most we have carried out repeat surveys for occupancy modeling during the two main migration periods. But at quite a few of these sites, we've also established constant effort mist netting stations to study the stopover behavior of individual birds. So with that little introduction aside, I want to begin just by talking about the neotropical region. So the neotropical region is perhaps far more diverse than we often perceive it to be in terms of the ecosystems present. And this diversity of land cover types and habitats is driven by extreme variability in precipitation and also in elevation. So in this map of annual rainfall across our main study region, you can see here, we have areas varying from what would be described as desertic with extremely low rainfall to some of the wettest places on Earth and everything in between. And so we have this whole gradient of habitats from dry to wet, which birds must either choose to settle in during the stationary non-breeding period or be selecting as stopover habitats. And that variability extends to elevations I mentioned, with peaks over 5,000 meters in several areas. And just to give you a sense of that variation, I just want to run through a series of images. So here we're in Northwest Colombia, in lowland, humid, steamy, tropical rainforest, but there's also areas with natural grasslands interspersed by riparian forest. And then at the other extreme, we have these very dry habitats on the Guajira Peninsula. And what's really remarkable is that over very small distances, we have these juxtaposed habitats created by very steep gradients and precipitation. So just a mere 100 kilometers from the Guajira Peninsula, we find the Santa Marta Mountains, where we find humid montane forest and soaring peaks with snow on top above 5,000 meters. And then immersed in all these natural ecosystems, we also find obviously agricultural systems, and among them there are several that are of importance to migratory land birds, such as shade-grown coffee, for example. Now, I said I wasn't going to dive into the stationary non-breeding areas that birds are using in the neotropical region, but I do want to mention them in the context of how they contribute to migration and therefore to the Americas flyway. And I think this is an often overlooked property of stationary non-breeding areas, that they can provide significant amounts of fuel for spring migration as birds head north to breeding grounds. So in this example we have here is an example of blackpoll warblers gaining fuel immediately prior to migration in early May, as reflected in changes in body mass in the Orinoco region of Colombia. And this massive increase in body mass, which is primarily fuel for flight, translates into a potential flight range of around 2,700 kilometers. So this is a significant portion of the migratory journey. Somewhere between 50 and 60% of the entire journey to the boreal breeding grounds can be covered with fuel acquired on the stationary non-breeding grounds. So clearly these non-breeding habitats actually have a significant role to play in shaping migratory strategies within this flyway. But as I said, I really want to focus today primarily on what we've learned about stopover ecology over the last decade. And this is very much going to be through the lens of where birds acquire the energy for flight. We know that for a successful migration, energy is key. I think Marius's talk will really hit home that idea of how important the distribution of energy in space and time is to migratory birds. And so we're very much going to be focusing over the next 20 minutes or so on where birds can find that energy they need to successfully complete their migration. So what do we know about neotropical habitats as stopover sites? How are birds using these as stopovers? Well, a common theme we're finding as we study more and more species and more sites is that many species are making multi-day extended stopovers. And this is somewhat in contrast to what much of the literature over the last couple of decades suggests is happening in temperate regions, where there's very much this kind of concept that birds are making relatively short flights and regular stops. And in contrast, what we're finding here is long stops and long flights. Modern tracking technology is starting to change that paradigm very much for the temperate area, but so far what we find for the neotropical region is these extended stopovers are common. So here's a very simple example of just Tennessee warblers in the Santa Marta Mountains in northern Colombia in spring, making stopovers of around a week or longer. These are very simple stopover metrics based on capture, recapture, and the minimum stopover. They normally underestimate durations, but it gives us a sense of these longer durations of stopovers that birds are making. Another example, cerulean warblers during fall stopover in Costa Rica. This is a very difficult species to capture and even more difficult to recapture. So we deployed radio transmitters and utilized automated radio telemetry using Motus technology to be able to quantify stopover durations in this species. And in the population that we managed to capture, we found an average duration of 7 days. So again, these fairly long stopovers, and certain individuals staying much longer. So here we have kind of the detection pattern of an adult female during 13 days in mid-September, with each dot representing a detection on our automated telemetry station. And you can see a clear departure signal at the end on the 21st of September, that spike of orange dots as the bird takes off and departs south. So these extended durations seem to be common. We can see them again here in these two examples of Catharus thrushes in Colombia. And this begs the question is, why are these birds spending so long at these stopover sites? What are they actually using them for? So you could hypothesize that potentially that resources are limited at these sites and birds have to stay longer than you might expect, or that high competition with residents is suppressing fuel deposition rates. But really what we're finding couldn't be much further from that idea. And so instead, what we're finding is that birds are able to achieve very rapid fuel deposition rates in these sites, and that they are undergoing extensive fueling while on these long stopovers. So you're going to see a bunch of graphs like these two over the course of this talk. So I just want to explain a little bit of what you're seeing here, just so it's easy to digest them as we move forward. So on the left-hand side, we're looking at change in body mass over time in gray-cheeked thrushes recaptured on one or more occasions during their spring stopover in Colombia. So each of those symbols is the change in body mass of an individual bird between its first capture and any subsequent capture. And those lines are basically just showing the average body mass trajectory within the population. And so looking at these graphs, it's immediately obvious that these birds are increasing their body mass considerably. And during these stopovers, body mass is a surrogate for fuel reserves. So in the case of gray-cheeked thrush, we're seeing these birds increase their body mass by anywhere between 25 to 45% over a 10 to 14 day stopover. So a really significant increase in body mass and fuel reserves. And for those who want to kind of have a sense of what that means in terms of like grams of fuel available, on the right, we have this example of veeries during fall also in northern Colombia. And these are lines connecting individual body masses of birds separated in time. We can see that some individuals are increasing their body mass by over 10 grams between subsequent captures. So these extended stopovers generally are supporting these extensive fueling bouts as birds prepare for the next phase of their migratory journey. And we have many examples of this now from multiple different sites. It's not just something that's restricted to some of these areas in northern Colombia. Here's an example from the Caribbean slope of Costa Rica, where we saw that cerulean warbler example. And here we have a bunch of different species, all showing similar long stopover durations and extensive fueling, and this remarkable set of recaptures in red-eyed vireos down the bottom left-hand corner there, which just shows the sheer abundance of birds stopping over in this region during fall migration. So some of you may be asking, well, okay, so these birds are staying for a long time, they're accumulating large fuel reserves. But what does that mean for subsequent phases of the migration? Well, the way we're interpreting this is that long distance, long haul flights following these neotropical stopovers are kind of the norm, that they're fairly common. And that means that stopover sites are far more dispersed in space and will be fewer during a given migratory journey than perhaps we've been led to believe by studies in the past, where there's a sense that birds are stopping on multiple occasions at multiple different stopover sites to gain fuel. Is there evidence for that? Well, yes. So in the case of the grey-cheeked thrush that we just saw making these very large body mass gains, we were able to track them from northern Colombia using radio transmitters and again using the Motus automated telemetry array to track them north on their migration towards their breeding grounds in the boreal region. And what we found was several individuals that made non-stop flights just based on the time between detections of well over 2,000 kilometers, and in some cases, some individuals breaking through that 3,500 kilometer mark and basically making direct flights from Colombia all the way up to the Great Lakes region. So this really emphasizes not only the individual importance of a given stopover site in the overall migratory strategy of these birds, but that these neotropical stopover sites with abundant resources can be providing fuel for well over 50% of the entire migratory journey of these birds. So really changes the way we think about how birds are using space and using sites along the length of a migratory journey. But this doesn't actually seem to be a phenomenon that's restricted to tropical or neotropical areas. So we're all aware of the example of blackpoll warblers taking off from the northeastern Atlantic coast of the US, flying across the Atlantic down to South America, a 3-day non-stop flight, which obviously requires extensive fueling beforehand. But I think there are many similar strategies among a wide variety of species that we just haven't realized exist yet. And this is an example of one that I kind of stumbled across the other day, where I was investigating our data on stopovers of bay-breasted warblers in Costa Rica. And I began to wonder, well, where are these bay-breasted warblers coming from? Why are they stopping over in Costa Rica rather than, say, further north in Central America? And when I was running through the weekly abundance models in eBird status and trends for this species, I was very surprised to come across this image on the left, where it clearly shows a very high concentration of bay-breasted warblers in the southern Appalachian region, and really nothing between there and this kind of landing pad in Costa Rica and Panama, and suggests that perhaps the birds we were catching in Costa Rica are making 3,000-kilometer flights from the southern Appalachians, very similar to the way blackpoll warblers do it across the Atlantic, that have yet to be recognized. So if anybody out there has recaptured data on these birds in the Appalachian region, please contact me afterwards, because I'd love to explore this remarkable migration further. So there is this general pattern among several species of long stopovers and subsequent long flights, but it's not true for all, and that's not surprising. There's always going to be a variety of strategies, and Canada warbler is one of these species that bucks that trend. They seem to hop from one mountain to another through Central America as they move through the neotropical region. And despite finding from our occupancy surveys what seem to be fairly concentrated areas of use by Canada warblers, who were expected perhaps they're stopping over for longer, reflected by the reds and the yellow colors in this spatial projection of our occupancy models here. Actually, at these sites, we found good captures, good numbers of birds passing through, but very few were stopping, as reflected on this graph on the right. So that brings me to the role of these different neotropical habitats. So that example of Canada warblers hints at the idea that birds are keying on some certain very specific habitats. So Canada warblers are keying in on these mid-montane, mid-elevation habitats. And actually we find that pattern in several species, that they are focused, their stopovers are very much concentrated in certain habitat types that are providing certain optimum conditions. And there is no better example than the grey-cheeked thrush. So when we collected data across northern Colombia, ran occupancy models, and produced these spatial predictions, it was somewhat of a surprise to find that really all the birds are concentrated in these foothill and pre-montane forests in the Santa Marta Mountains, where we have recorded these remarkable body mass gains. And this is not a pattern that's unique to grey-cheeked thrushes. So we're finding that each species shows a fairly specific or habitat-specific pattern in terms of where they're actually stopping over. So this is kind of contrary to the idea that there's this broad front migration and birds will stop over across a wide landscape with a wide variety of conditions. But instead, they're selecting fairly specific conditions within these diverse neotropical gradients or landscapes. So yellow-billed cuckoos here are stopping over in lowland tropical dry forest. They're very much avoiding humid areas along the Caribbean coast. And we can see these patterns play out in a whole series of species. Here we have 20 different species, and you can see that each individual species shows a slightly different variation on the theme, but very few of them kind of are showing evidence for the idea that they may just be stopping over wherever they can across a broad front. And these individual preferences lead to kind of community level patterns where we find that there are certain areas that are obviously providing excellent conditions for fueling birds that are used by multiple species in the community. And that's kind of reflected in this map on the right, where that area around the Santa Marta Mountains in the northeast, but also the northwest with that connection to Central America is also key stopover area for several species. But one of the questions is, why are these birds selecting these given habitats? What are they providing? And one of the things that keeps coming up is, and that several of these different habitats have in common, is that they are seasonal. And some of them are actually highly seasonal. And so the difference here to temperate systems, this isn't driven by variations in day length and temperature over the year, but instead by precipitation patterns. And this is an excellent example here of the blackpoll warbler, which we know makes these incredible flights during fall across the Atlantic Ocean down towards South America. And after such a grueling journey, you might expect them to key in on humid habitats full of food, but surprisingly, they concentrate in some of the driest areas in Colombia on the Guajira Peninsula, but also in coastal Venezuela. And they're focusing on what's termed as Caribbean thorn scrub or tropical thorn scrub, which is this highly seasonal habitat that for much of the year looks like this image on the left, where it's basically bare. It's termed as ecologically dead in several publications for most of the year, but it wakes up during a very brief and sharp rainy season between September and November, when it starts to grow, it leaves up, and we assume that there is this concurrent increase in resources and a spike in resource abundance that the blackpoll warblers are taking advantage of. And it seems to be that that the two are perfectly synchronized. So the arrival of blackpoll warblers in October perfectly coincides with the peak of the rainy season in this region. And we find something very similar with the yellow-billed cuckoos in those dry forests in the lowlands of Colombia. These dry forests are habitat that are actually used by very few migratory land birds during the stationary non-breeding period. But in migration, there are many more birds using them. And this is because spring migration coincides with the onset of the rainy season. So we see these habitats transform from dry, barren, leafless habitats to suddenly these, lush green habitats, much in the same way that temperate habitats do on the breeding grounds. So it seems, birds are actually keying into these seasonal changes and these pulses of resources which they can take advantage of for stopovers and to fuel these onward flights, long distance flights. And what we've also been finding, and it's not surprising after what I've just said, that not all habitats are the same. So some are providing more resources than others. And this is really interesting to explore from both in understanding what habitats birds are using, but also from a conservation perspective. So here on the left, we come back to our example of blackpoll warblers landing on the Guajira Peninsula in Colombia, and you find these very subtly different habitats. Some are slightly more forest-like with a slightly higher canopy, but there's vast areas of these very low canopy dry scrub. And what we found the first time we studied this was that birds had higher fueling rates in these more forest-like habitats, which perhaps kind of makes logical sense in terms of vegetation complexity. But I'll come back to that shortly. But another example here is that of Tennessee warblers, where we found higher fueling rates in native forests versus shade coffee, which again kind of makes sense when you think about maybe modified habitats not having as many resources. But the interesting thing is these differences play out in stopover strategies, durations, and the potential flight ranges of birds, which when they leave, which means that birds leaving from these slightly poorer quality habitats will be able to fly less distance, and that's going to influence the organization of their migration afterwards. And that's something we've been able to demonstrate really quite clearly in grey-cheeked thrushes with a much more subtle example, where this species is spread out across an elevation gradient with very subtle differences in forest structure, but where we find, again, these differences in fuel deposition rates between one forest and another. And these actually translate into smaller fuel reserves for birds fueling in the poorer quality forest versus those in the higher quality. And this results in a slower migration when we track these birds northwards through the MOTIS automated telemetry array. So there's actually a carryover effect of this variation in resource availability between these different habitats. But what has been even more surprising is that this habitat quality is not stable between years. And actually, it's highly variable. The way birds are using these different habitats varies considerably. So we're coming back here, our example of the black-billed warbler in these dry habitats in the Guajira Peninsula. On the left, the graph from our first year in 2017, where forest was clearly the better quality habitat, higher fuel deposition rates. And when we came back in 2018, we found a completely different pattern. There were almost no birds in the forest. We didn't catch enough to actually model their fuel deposition rate. And instead, fuel deposition rates in the dry scrub were almost three times higher than they were in the first year. So a remarkable flip in the quality of habitats from one year to another. And we found that birds are almost tracking this. So the number of black-billed warblers between years was kind of related to the quality or the speed at which birds could fuel in one habitat or another. And then after the first 2 years, things got crazy. In the last couple of years with La Nina, when it seems that suitable conditions suddenly became much more widespread, the number of birds present on our sites were reduced. So really just a huge amount of variability going on. We find the same thing with the grey-cheeked thrushes, where we thought there was this very neat pattern with higher quality forest and fruit resources in particular for birds at lower elevations and decreasing at higher elevations in the Santa Marta Mountains. But again, when we went back in subsequent years, those patterns started to change, and we saw this year-to-year variation, which seems to be associated with variation in fruiting phenology from one year to the next at the different elevations. So I've run through a lot of information. I just want to leave you with some of kind of the take-home messages from this body of work. So the first is that these multi-day prolonged stopovers seem to be common, seem to be the main strategy in many species in the Neotropical region, and that they are used for rapid and extensive fuel gains, which enable birds to fuel a significant proportion of their migratory journey. And this translates into what I think as strategies which are much more orientated around the use of just 2, 3, maybe 4 maximum stopover sites that are actually used for fuel gain during migration, and a bunch of other sites that are used for rest roost stops. But really the energy is gained at just a set of key sites, and that's powering much of the migratory journey. And that there are these seasonal resource peaks in the tropics that seem to be an integral part of stopover ecology, which is a really interesting kind of added piece to the way we think about how migrants are tracking resources over space and time. But also there's this remarkable finding that there's this huge variation in conditions between habitats and years. And that means that birds can't necessarily be site faithful to these stopover sites, but instead they must be making stopover site choices based on current conditions to an extent. And that those choices are actually going to have a significant impact on their subsequent migration speed, arrival time at breeding grounds, and therefore can really be influencing potentially demographic patterns over the full annual life cycle. So I'll leave you with that. Thank you very much for listening. I'd like to thank all the donors, partners, our incredible research team here in Colombia and through Central America. And I will be happy to take any of your questions. Thank you.